In a world where a lot of rappers spend more time performing power than actually owning it, Rick Ross used to be the exception. Rick Ross was the guy every young hustler wanted to be. Rick Ross was the mansion, the beard, the deep-voiced ad-lib, the fleet of cars, the Wingstop empire, the boss anthem playing in every gym in America. Rick Ross was the closest thing hip-hop had to a walking billboard for what made it was supposed to look like. And now, in 2026, Rick Ross has quietly turned into the exact opposite of everything he built his brand around. The empire cracked. The image caved in. The receipts don't lie. And the strangest part of the whole thing is that Rick, or call it what you want, that name was taken. William Leonard Roberts II was born in Clarksdale, Mississippi in January of 1976, then moved down to Carroll City, Florida as a kid. Growing up in a stretch of Miami where the neighborhood on one side of the line looked like paradise and the neighborhood on his side looked like something the postcard people wanted you to forget. Rick Ross played football, earned a scholarship at Albany State, and then dropped out and went chasing rap. He ran with Carroll City Cartel under the name Teflon Don and got nowhere. Then Rick Ross found the story of Freeway Ricky Ross, a real drug kingpin, a real man serving real time in a federal prison cell, and Rick Ross decided he was going to become that man on record. That is the moment the empire started, and that is also the moment the empire started rotting from the inside. The 2006 single Hustlin' hit like a freight train. Rick Ross had one of those voices that turned a boast into a law of physics. Rick Ross followed it with Port of Miami, and the album debuted at #1, moved 187,000 in the first week, and locked Rick Ross into Def Jam's throne room. From there, Rick Ross ran a hot streak most artists don't even sniff, Teflon Don in 2010, God Forgives, I Don't in 2012, Mastermind in 2014. Rick Ross launched Maybach Music Group and stacked a roster that read like a Miami All-Star team. Meek Mill, Whale, French Montana, Amarian. Rick Ross bought the mansion. Rick Ross bought the other mansion. Rick Ross bought the 235-acre, 109-room Georgia estate that looked less like a house and more like a country. Rick Ross partnered with Luke Belair and Bumbu, invested in the telemedicine company Jedoc, put his name on 3 books, and quietly stacked something like 25 Wingstop locations across the Southeast. 25 Wingstops. Read that number again. 25. The man is powered by chicken. By every visible metric, Rick Ross had won. Rick Ross had beaten the game. Rick Ross had done the thing 100 rappers before him had rapped about and never actually pulled off. And yet the entire time Rick Ross was climbing, the foundation underneath him was quietly termite-eaten. Because the truth of the matter is that a boss brand built on a lie is not a boss brand, it is a countdown clock. And Rick Ross's countdown started the second he put on the name. The first crack was the name lawsuit. When the real Freeway Ricky Ross got out of prison in 2009, he was not exactly amused to find a rapper making tens of millions of dollars off his identity while he had been locked in a cell studying law books. Freeway filed a $10 million copyright and right of publicity suit in California federal court in June of 2010. The case dragged for 4 years. In 2014, the court ruled in the rapper's favor, citing the First Amendment. Rick Ross technically won the case. But everybody who cared about the culture already had the verdict they needed. Rick Ross was not a boss. Rick Ross was a cosplay. Rick Ross had put on another man's biography like a Halloween fit. And that was just the first crack. The second crack, the one that never healed, was Officer Ricky. From 1995 to 1997, Rick Ross worked as a corrections officer at the South Florida Reception Center in Dade County. Not a mistake. Not a rumor. A W-2 job. Then Rick Ross rebranded as a kingpin, put out Port of Miami, made the whole world believe he was a Miami mob boss, and in 2008 the CO photo leaked online. Rick Ross said the picture was fake. Rick Ross said it had been manipulated. Rick Ross said he had never worn that uniform. And then the smoking gun pulled his employment records, his real social security number, his real hiring date, his real resignation date, his real salary, and dropped them on the internet. The whole thing came apart in a weekend. And then 50 Cent, who had been circling for months, dropped Officer Ricky, and the industry watched Rick Ross's brand get shredded live on TV. That should have been the moment Rick Ross owned it. A single interview. A single sentence. Yeah, that was me before rap. Now watch what I do. Instead, Rick Ross doubled down on the denials, and the doubling down has not stopped. In an interview with Full Send in 2024, Rick Ross admitted he worked as a CO, but claimed it was only for 4 months. The paperwork says 18 months. Rick Ross is a grown man with 25 Wingstops, and he is still fudging the dates on a resume from 30 years ago. Period. End of story. That Officer stain is the reason Gilly the Kid could rag on Rick Ross in 2022 and land a body blow. That Officer stain is the reason Drake could drop the Turning 50 and the Officer Ricky bar on Push UPS in 2024 and every listener nodded. That Officer stain is the reason Rick Ross cannot punch back on any beef without half the internet reminding him what uniform he used to wear. And here is the wild part, Rick Ross could still fix it. Rick Ross could sit down tomorrow, own the past, laugh at himself, and the internet would move on inside of 48 hours. Instead, Rick Ross keeps ducking the question, keeps rebranding the timeline, keeps pretending the receipts do not exist. That is the meltdown loop. That is the pattern the entire rest of the story runs on. Now, the honorable mention crack, because if you have ever heard the verse you cannot unhear it, the U.O.E.N.O feature in 2013. Rick Ross rapped a line about putting Molly in a woman's champagne and taking her home so that she didn't even know it. It is one of the ugliest bars ever printed to a commercial rap record. There is no clever reading of it. There is no excuse for it. The backlash was instant. Women's advocacy groups organized against Rick Ross. Reebok terminated his endorsement deal, and Rick Ross issued an apology that everyone knew was not really an apology. Somehow Rick Ross survived that too. But every rough patch was building callus, and the callus was starting to look like scar tissue. Now strip away the gold chains for a second and look at the pattern. Every single one of these controversies, the stolen name, the fake kingpin backstory, the U.O.E.N.O verse, had one common feature. Rick Ross, by another Wingstop. Except Rick Ross did not move on. Rick Ross could not move on. That is where the meltdown loop enters its terminal phase. In 2025, Drake finally released his Iceman album, and on the song, Make Them Pay, Drake casually name-checked Rick Ross with a low-voltage jab about Aiden Ross. That was it. One line. A footnote. The kind of bar you skip on the second listen. Any professional in Rick Ross's position would have ignored it. Rick Ross did not ignore it. Rick Ross went home, opened his laptop, screenshotted a folder of negative comments about Drake's album, and sat down in front of a camera and read every one of them out loud. Rick Ross then went on Patrick Bet-David's podcast and mocked Drake for singing too much and sounding too sensitive. Rick Ross then went on the Joe and Jada podcast, and when Fat Joe asked why the tension was still there, Rick Ross grinned into the mic and said he always enjoys giving out a spanking. Rick Ross did all of this on tape. Voluntarily. In HD. And no, both men built brands that require constant flexing to justify themselves. Both men are watching in real time as the culture rotates toward a quieter, more independent kind of success, the Kendrick model, the PG Lang model, the own everything and say nothing model. And the more that model wins, the louder Rick Ross has to yell to prove his own is still relevant. It is the exact same trap Drake is in, one weight class down. Rick Ross sees it. Rick Ross knows it. Rick Ross cannot stop it. That is the meltdown loop in one sentence. And then came the airport clip. In 2023, Rick Ross had bought himself a $25 million Gulfstream G550 and painted his own name on the side of it. Why? Because Rick Ross is Rick Ross. That is the whole product. And then in June, a video went viral of Rick Ross sitting at a commercial airport gate. Not first class. Not a private terminal. A gate. Rick Ross was wearing his usual oversized shades, but he was also slumped down, chin tucked into his chest, hand half covering his face like a witness under subpoena. Rick Ross and Drake, because Drake is Drake, logged onto Instagram and quietly liked the post. Petty behavior on both sides. But the numbers do not care about petty. The numbers said the anniversary tour of the album that made Rick Ross a legend could not fill a room in 2026 without a coupon. That is not a career ender by itself. Plenty of veterans have soft tours. The problem is that Rick Ross has spent 20 years telling the world he is the biggest boss alive, and now the biggest boss alive is running the ticketing equivalent of a Denny's Grand Slam promotion. Then came the sneaker vendor clip. Rick Ross negotiating with a street sneaker vendor, saying if he could take 22 for the pair he would take 22. Regular human behavior. Rational, even smart. But Rick Ross is not selling regular. Rick Ross is selling untouchable. And the second Rick Ross starts haggling over a pair of shoes on camera, 12 million people see the illusion crack. Then Rick Ross tried to laugh it off by posting a self-aware skit about hiding in Costco and AutoZone, but self-awareness on delay is not self-awareness. Self-awareness after the internet already caught you is damage control in a tuxedo. Step back for a second. This is the part almost nobody in the commentary space is willing to say out loud. Rick Ross is not going broke. That is not what is happening. Rick Ross could probably sell one Georgia mansion tomorrow and eat for the rest of his life. What is actually happening is worse than going broke. Rick Ross has become a prisoner of his own image. Rick Ross cannot make a rational financial decision in public without the entire internet framing it as evidence of decline. Rick Ross cannot fly commercial without shame. Rick Ross cannot haggle for shoes without shame. Rick Ross cannot ignore a one-line Drake diss without shame. The exact brand Rick Ross built to protect himself from being seen as small has become the reason every small moment gets amplified until it looks catastrophic. Rick Ross built a golden cage, walked inside, and threw away the key on a live stream. And that is why Rick Ross is spending his 2026 crashing out on Drake instead of running his empire. Because if Rick Ross stops performing, the performance ends. And if the performance ends, the audience starts asking what was ever real in the first place. So Rick Ross keeps talking. Rick Ross keeps posting. Rick Ross keeps grinning into podcast microphones about spanking a man he already beat. Rick Ross keeps doing exactly the wrong thing over and over because the right thing, silence, would cost him the only currency he has left, which is visibility. Zoom the camera all the way out, and there are 3 lessons buried in the Rick Ross story that every young hustler watching this needs to write down. Lesson 1. Never build your brand on a lie you cannot back up. The name theft, the CO cover-up, the fake mob boss origin story, none of it needed to be a lie. Rick Ross could have been the corrections officer who left the system and became a rap star, and that story would have been more compelling than the fake one. Rick Ross chose the mask, and the mask ate him. Lesson 2. Be careful how loud you perform your identity, because eventually you have to live inside it. Rick Ross cannot buy generic detergent at Target in 2026 without going viral. That is not fame. That is a hostage situation with a beard. Lesson 3. And this is the one Rick Ross himself is failing right now in real time. Sometimes the smartest move a rich man can make is silence. You do not have to respond to every one-liner. You do not have to record a rebuttal every time your name gets mentioned in a verse. Sometimes the boss move is to walk away and let the receipts talk for you. Rick Ross forgot that lesson, and now he is teaching it to us in reverse. The strangest part of this whole thing is the timing. Rick Ross is watching, in real time, the exact opposite playbook succeed. Kendrick Lamar is quietly building an empire without saying a word for months at a time. Kendrick's business is louder than his mouth. Meanwhile, Rick Ross's mouth is louder than his business, and every day the gap between the two gets a little more embarrassing to watch. It is not that Rick Ross has lost the money. It is that Rick Ross has lost the game the money was supposed to buy him access to. The next generation is not buying volume anymore. They are buying ownership. And Rick Ross, the man who wrote the book on volume, cannot pivot in time. Which brings us all the way back to the very first question this video opened with. How does the biggest boss in rap accidentally expose his own empire as a lie? Answer: he keeps talking, keeps ducking, keeps performing, keeps mistaking noise for power. And on the day the culture finally turns the volume down, the emperor is left standing on stage with the microphone still hot, wondering where the room went. Rick Ross is not done. Let us be clear on that. Rick Ross still owns the mansions, still owns the Wingstops, still owns the label, still owns a masterpiece run of albums that will outlive every meme cycle. Nobody is deleting Teflon Don from Spotify. Nobody is unlistening to God Forgives, I Don't. Rick Ross's musical legacy is safe. What is not safe is Rick Ross's mythology, the boss of bosses fantasy the whole brand was sold under. That mythology is bleeding out on live streams, on podcast couches, at airport gates, and in sneaker vendor negotiations. And every extra second Rick Ross spends pretending it is not happening is another second the bleeding gets worse. So drop your take in the comments. Is Rick Ross cooked, or is this the pre-comeback quiet before Rick Ross flips the whole thing and shows up next year with a masterpiece and a mea culpa? Does the mask come off, or does the mask fuse to the face? Does Rick Ross out-Kendrick the culture by finally choosing silence, or does he spend the rest of his career trapped in the meltdown loop, chasing Drake's echo through every podcast studio on the East Coast? Do not just say he's washed and scroll. Give me the receipts. Tell me what year you first saw the crack. Tell me the moment you stopped believing the myth. Because if this thing has taught the culture anything, it is that the biggest boss in the room is almost never the one yelling that he is the biggest boss in the room. If you are still rolling with me at this point in the video, hit the sub button, and if you want the deep dive on why Offset is going through his own version of this exact same collapse, I have the full breakdown loaded up next. Do not miss that one. Click it now.